book will focus on, which is Catholic radio stations in Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru. As it is, could you paint a picture for us of what these places look like? I mean, you've done this a bit already, maybe a fuller picture, and sort of why did missionaries turn specifically to radio rather than other mediums that they might have had available to them?
Yeah, thank you. So I've mentioned that this is the area I'm looking at are particularly mountainous places where radio hadn't arrived via commercial channels or state enterprise. But the case of Radio Sutatensa that we've just heard was a kind of example of how you could use radio as a tool of development. So listeners would gather together as a group called a radio school. This could be in a very poor context, somebody's house, a community hall, not a school in the conventional sense. And then all you needed was an assistant who would lead the program, turn the radio on at a specified time, and kind of keep notes so that people could check on what they've heard. And this was seen as a great route to development, but it was also a way of spreading Catholic doctrine. And this became very appealing for missionaries in particular. So I've been uncovering the case of Radio San Gabriel in Bolivia, in the high plains. And there it was seen as a way of extending the parish priest's ability to access people, because going on foot was the only other alternative. There weren't roads to a lot of the places that they wanted to go.
Interesting. And so could you tell us a little bit more about Radio San Gabriel? It was founded by a Maryknoll priest, so that's Father Brendan Ryan. So could you tell us a bit about him and sort of how the station got started and maybe some challenges that he faced in sort of initiating this, both from, because Maryknoll is in New Jersey, I believe, or New York.
Yeah, they're based in New York, upstate New York. So the Maryknoll fathers and brothers, there are also Maryknoll sisters who became involved in revolutionary politics, actually, which tells you something about how the organization changed. It began in the early 20th century as a foreign missionary society. It was principally based in East Asia to begin with, but following the Second World War, it was displaced. It no longer was safe to be operating in East Asia. And so Latin America was somewhere that missionaries were relocated to, and then became a whole new kind of arena for missionary activity.
So how did he come around to found Radio San Gabriel? Where did that come from?
Yeah, so I mean, I've come across the correspondence between Father Ryan and his superiors in New York, and he's rather exasperated that he's had this great idea of setting up a radio station and doing radio schools similar to those that have been used in Colombia. But the superiors are kind of dragging their feet. They're not sure if it's going to work out. They think it could be a reputational risk. But eventually in 1955, he gets the go-ahead. And the station becomes really popular, particularly because it's broadcasting in Aymara. And so this is kind of revolutionary for communities that have not been able to access print media a lot of the time. So suddenly they're able to make contact with people across Bolivia. They are hearing traditional music, having their culture represented. And so something that begins with a sort of intent to evangelize and to spread Catholic doctrine actually becomes much more rooted in local culture.
Yeah, they have to start seeking out local partners, I'm assuming, because I don't think he would have spoken great Aymara. So how did that process sort of work? Was that more of a sort of bottom-up process where they realized to properly reach people, they'd have to also collaborate and do more of a grassroots activity? Or was that maybe a more I don't think it would have been, but was it more of a top-down?
Yeah, so this is one of the struggles that Father Ryan has with his superiors, that they say, oh, this is all pie in the sky because you don't speak Aymara. He replies that, he's already in a year learnt enough to be able to hear confessions in Aymara. But interestingly, he says, even if I studied it for 20 years, I wouldn't be able to broadcast in Aymara because it has to be done by a native Aymara speaker. So he already recognized that the authenticity of the program was important, and building those kind of collaborations was really important.
And I also read somewhere that one of his first funding was from the US as well. And part of this was because radio stations were sort of framed as a vaccine against communism, because they sort of saw these rural, very poor communities as sort of like ripe for the next revolution. So how did that actually work in practice? And can you explain some of the underlying logic, both from, I guess, the priests accepting this funding and maybe these larger organizations who are giving the funding
Yeah,
for these
so
stations?
so the Cold War context is really crucial here. So I've mentioned the Marinol, but actually a lot of the funding for Radio San Gabriel comes from Harry Truman's program Point Four, which is a funding stream that allows funding of any kind of cultural activity that is anti-communist in nature. And in addition to that, there's the US Information Society, which has a similar role, and in Europe is running all sorts of anti-communist radio stations as well. And the idea behind this kind of vaccine against communism is that rural communities that are cut off from development, suffering extreme poverty, are those most likely to turn to communism. And it's no coincidence that actually Che Guevara is in Bolivia in 1967 at the time that he's killed by counterinsurgency soldiers. So these remote rural locations are seen as precisely the area where another Cuban revolution might happen. And so it's thought that by getting to them first, by spreading development, spreading education, you could deter them from joining revolutionary movements.
And so in what ways did they sort of promote a pro-capitalist education? What was the logic behind how radio itself? Because, I mean, you could also take the argument that literacy and allowing sort of people to engage with the worlds in a much sort of broader way in new mediums could actually do the opposite. So how was it initially meant to sort of ensure that anti-communism was promoted?
Well, this comes across particularly in the programming of Radio Sutatensa in Colombia, where you had the idea of the modern peasant who could be judged by his or her sort of implementation of recommended forms of farming. So using fertilizers, using imported seed varieties, setting up capitalist enterprises on the farm, such as a chicken coop or a rabbit farm. All of these were taken to be examples of being a good citizen. So linking that idea of being a good citizen to actually adopting capitalist practices in your farming and your kind of use of the land was quite a powerful discourse.
Interesting. And did all the funding sort of come from just the US and these sort of missionary associations, or were there any other maybe more transnational networks that were also created to fund these stations?
Yeah, so West Germany also plays a big role here. The bishops were very influential, and they were present in Latin America in a way that I think isn't commonly recognized. They were sort of heavily supportive of radio initiatives in particular because they saw it as a way of having cultural impact. And so you get charities like Mesarior, which still exist today, but have kind of reformulated themselves as international development NGOs.
Oh, interesting. And so what I found really interesting is we've been talking a lot about this sort of like radio stations vaccine against communism, but what your research also aims to look is how these stations changed over time. And I guess this has a lot to do with, you're talking about Radio San Gabriel being in Aymara and sort of championing Aymara culture. So how do they sort of start out these quite paternalist sort of bringing enlightenment to backward peasant populations into a new form? How does that story sort of begin and end? What happened to promote this change?
So I think it's a gradual thing. So I'm studying the period from the 1950s through to the 1980s. And it has to do with the way that rural areas become the focus of a whole range of development actors at this time. So there are sort of NGOs, state development organizations cropping up, but there's also an important cultural movement here. You know, this is the period when indigenous languages are starting to reassert themselves after being heavily discriminated against for a very long time. And so you get the celebration of Aymara history, and also the fact that the radio station itself is relying on the labor of local Aymara people who themselves began to suggest content or present on the radio or bring in kind of musicians, actors from the local region.
And do you see this in each country that you're looking at, in Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, or are there like differences between them in terms of the way they champion indigenous culture, any other cultures, or they start to shift maybe to more radical?
So there's an important difference, I think, between Colombia and both Peru and Bolivia in this respect, which has to do with the proportion of the population that identify as indigenous. Mm-hmm. So in Colombia, there's a heavy discourse of sort of mixed raceness, mestizo, and so Radio Sutatenso, which had national coverage, never broadcast in indigenous languages. It did vary its content by regional, so there was some recognition of different regional cultures, but the question of language was much more prominent in Peru, the case of Quechua in Peru and Aymara in Bolivia.
Do you think this also then translated to maybe a difference in shift in how radical the politics of each radio got as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are cases in Colombia that I haven't yet uncovered that probably were more radical in nature, but certainly in the case of Peru, we see how Radio Onda Azul, which was also a Marinol station, became involved in struggles for land reform, started to champion kind of socialist ideas that went quite far from its kind of original missionary focus.
That's very interesting. And I found interesting about the Bolivian case as well is they quite explicitly take this on. It's not just that they as well, but they call eventually their slogan changes to the voice of the Aymara people. So they very